The first question I want to ask is, and we'll start with Captain O'Shea here. Captain O'Shea, and if Colonel, you got promoted since Sunday.
Navy captain, that's all right.
Hey, I was partial to the Navy, so that's fine. That's fine. If you could briefly tell us how you came to aviation.
Well, I came to aviation. I tried to get in in the Air Corps back in '43, but they had too many pilots, and I was an engineer officer, so they said, you stay as an engineer. So I went to Europe as an engineer officer in the Combat Engineer Battalion. Then after the war, I got a regular commission in '48, and at that time, they just started opening it up to have pilots in other branches than the artillery. And I was an infantry officer at that time, so, and I was an adjutant of this unit. So when the paper come across my desk out there looking for volunteers for liaison pilot school, I put my name in. And when I got to the battalion commander, he called me in and he says, what's this? I says, well, I'm going to go to liaison pilot school. And he said, hey, you just made regular officer. You're going down a dead-end road. You shouldn't be doing that. And I told him, well, I've been trying to get into the air since '43. And he says, well, if that's what you want, go ahead. So I went. And the time we got to the flight school, at that time, I was in 1950, in June, the same day that the North Koreans came across the border in Korea. And Harry Townsend, my friend over here, and Ed Landry and the thing were in the same flight class. And from then on, things went up, as far as I'm concerned, uphill. And we've come a long way.
How did you come to aviation?
I came to aviation originally. I was in college, and the Tuskegee experiment started. I didn't know what it was at that time, but I do know that they came to the college, Lincoln University, and asked if there were any of us who would like to learn to fly. At that time, the Army was segregated, and we didn't have the opportunities to learn to fly, either in civilian life or in the service. I volunteered, and when I took the eye exam, I had astigmatism. At that time, you could not wear glasses, so I flunked out of the Tuskegee Airmen. The next opportunity I had was when the Army put out a request for liaison pilots in 1947. And they kept putting it in the Army Times and didn't get enough volunteers. So I went to the Department of Army and saw an Air Force major at that time, Major J. Elmore Swenson, known to a lot of you. And I said, Major, why are you asking for volunteers? And I've volunteered for 3 years and can't get my application accepted. Why can't I learn to fly just like everybody else? And he shook his head and said that there was no discrimination in it, but he said, when can you be ready to go to school? And that was in 1949, and I said, no, I'm sorry, that was in 1950. He said that if you're ready to go, we'll put you in a class in June. That was in May. I went back and got chewed out by my regimental commander for not going through channels, but I did get into flight school in 1950 with my good friend over here, Captain Sidishay.
Well, my first deal was I was in OCS at Fort Sale in 1942, and somebody come along from someplace and said, we're looking for people to go to Army Aviation or then a liaison pilot school. I said, oh, I'll give that a try. So I went over to the airfield and the physical, passed the physical somehow. Went back, graduated from OCS December 10th, 1942, and went direct to Denton, Texas. And went through the, I guess, primary school, is what you'd call it. And finished up with primary school, went up to Fort Sill. Finished up there, I think it was April, May, someplace off like that. Reported to my first unit at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 941st Field Artillery. And we went to different maneuvers and the desert maneuvers and whatever else. And then I went to, when we come off of the desert maneuvers, we went straight to Boston. We turned in a Piper Cubs out there in the desert someplace, I can't even remember where. And we took a ship across the Atlantic, got into England. Now we're in England, April, May of 44, roughly. So they got us all set, got some airplanes, and I was in 5th Corps Artillery. And in 5th Corps, we had 13 planes, is what it amounted to when you added up all the separate field artillery battalions and whatever. So after fooling around doing certain things that took up time, we wound up down in Bournemouth, England, getting ready to cross the Channel. And while we were down there, now those of you that have flown in combat, remember that you had a Mae West, if you're going across water, you had a Mae West on, you had a parachute on your back, and that took up quite a bit of room, because those of you that have flown a Piper Cub, you realize there's not that much room in it. So we're just about getting ready to take off for Omaha, and somebody come along and says, we think the Germans are going to try to hit us with gas to repel us back into the channel. So you're going to have to put on impregnated clothing. Now, those of you who don't know what impregnated clothing is, it's about like that. There's no give to it. So now we've got that on. We're about 10 minutes before we're going to take off, along comes somebody and says, well, if you have an engine failure, you got to land in the water. So he had a boat. And this boat was looked like a parachute, really. It was about that big, and went in the seat. Now, those of you that have flown the Piper Cub realize that the aileron cable goes over your head, not very far. And I can't remember Jack's last name, but he was 6'1". I never figured out how he got through flight school, but at 6'1", and all that equipment I just told you about, that cable come across, hit him here, went over his head out there. Now, the strange thing about this whole thing, when we crossed the channel, they gave us that boat, if you remember, in case the engine failed. Well, I'm glad the engine didn't fail, because I couldn't have hit the water if I wanted to. There was 4 rows of ship going over, 4 rows of ship coming back. There was no water left. No problem there. So then we went to, I guess we're around 2,500 feet. And there was 13 of us in this formation. I wouldn't call it the greatest formation you ever laid eyes on, but it was a formation. And we went across the water, and the barrage balloons over Omaha Beach was supposed to be at 2,500 feet. Well, we were at 2,500 feet, and all of a sudden clouds come in underneath us. Now, we got to let down through those clouds. Those of you that have been in a Piper Cub realize that there's not a hell of a lot of instruments in there. So we let down. Now remember, there was 13 in the formation. As soon as we started that letdown, that formation got bigger and bigger and bigger. We let down, and we were supposed to break out around 2,000, and we broke out about 1,800, and they had the balloons at 1,500, so that turned out all right. Now we had our radios on, but it was all silent, supposedly. All of a sudden, over the radio comes, "Do not land in original fields. They're all still in enemy hands. Land on the crash strip above the beach." See, what we did on our airfields, we had a photograph down in Bournemouth, and we all picked out a place that we knew that our battalions or units were going to be, and I just picked out a field. The field had to be big enough to get into and out of, and that was it. But all those were still in enemy hands, so then we landed on the crash strip. I landed on that crash strip, which was very, very narrow. I pulled in, and where I pulled in was the greatest foxhole you ever laid eyes on. If I could ever find the kid that dug that, I'd put a medal on him. I spent the night in that foxhole. Anyway, that night a couple of German planes come over. AAAA was shooting at them. And those of you that have anything to do with AAAA realize that if they don't hit the airplane, what happens to them? Comes all back down. That happened all night long, and that foxhole got better and better all night long. I wound up with about, technically, 4 hits, but 8 holes. Those of you that flew the Piper Cub realize if you get hit on the top or the bottom, it went up the top, so you wound up with 2 holes. So I had 8 holes in the aircraft. I had a roll of tape, taped it up, and we took off. We took off from there and went into the first field where the 2nd Division was. Now, those of you that were in division aircraft realize there's 11 aircraft, and here's 13 more come in and land on this field, and the air officer of the 2nd Division was ready to kill us. "What are you doing? You can't be here. There's too many planes." Well, we're here. About 2 days we stayed there, and then finally they pushed the people down, and we went down to our place of operations, and that's where I operated for, I guess it was 2 months. Wound up flying. Now I'm in 5th Corps. 5th Corps run from the British on the left to the 7th Corps, which was at, what's the major city? St. Lo, that's the one I want. St. Lo, and I think 7th Corps took over right at St. Lo and went to the right. So you get up there and you fly there. And one day I was flying up there and on mission, and no particular targets come up, and I was just flying along. And I look way down south, and I could see 2 airplanes go by. They look like P-51s, so I didn't pay much attention to them. The next thing, I guess it was 15 or 20 minutes, I'm flying along in that Piper Cub at 60 miles an hour, as you know, and up comes this Messerschmitt behind me. It wasn't a Messerschmitt, it was a Focke-Wulf? 109, that's what it was, yeah. Anyway, he fired, and unfortunately, he didn't realize the speed of a Piper Cub. So he got too close. The shells and everything went underneath the wing and come together out in front of me. So I just pushed that stick forward. We went down into a dive. My poor observer, old Paul Hughes, had a pair of binoculars, and they were just laying down here against his stomach. And when I pushed that in, those come up. He wound up with 2 black eyes. Now I'm doing about 90 miles an hour, going straight down. I pulled out, everything's fine, the wings didn't fall off. Flew over and landed and checked out everything, everything's fine, except for poor old Paul had those black eyes. And that's about the big. Now I don't know. There was a pilot in the 2nd Division who had got jumped like I was, and he had gone into the same thing, but he must have pulled out maybe too abruptly or whatever, and nothing happened. And he's now flying across the trees and the forest to get to his airfield, and one wing fell off. He was killed. Now, I don't know what he pulled out at, but I can tell you at 90 it stays on. And that was my first real deal with the Piper Cub. And from there we went due south when we broke out. We talked about General McNair's death there. That held us up. After they finally got that mess cleared up, we flew due south, and my units went due south, and then we turned east. We didn't go to Paris right away because what we tried to do is pull up and try to cut off all those Germans that were in front of the English. Well, we never did get it completely closed off. We killed a lot of Germans, I'm sure, but most of them got away and got out to Paris or wherever. Then maybe 2 or 3 days later, we went on to Paris. Now in Paris, I landed in an airfield. I have no idea what it was. In other words, it was no great name that I could remember. And we were south of the city, and on the west side of the airfield was a high-rise apartment. And that night, all kinds of gunfire come out of those windows. So there were Germans in there that we didn't even know about. So the infantry got over there and took care of them. That took care of that. And maybe we spent about 2 days in that field, and then we took off and went east. I can't remember the names of the towns that we first went into on the Siegfried Line, or not the Siegfried Line itself, but the beginning of Germany. And then we stayed there for a while, and then we pulled up north. Where did we go from there? We went up to, we wound up in the Hürtgen Forest is where we wound up. The Hürtgen Forest was actually, you needed a password in the daytime. That's how thick the forest was. And after all the shelling we did to hit the Germans in the Hürtgen Forest, you didn't need the password any longer. There were no more leaves, there were no more nothing. Now our airfield, I don't remember what division we were supporting then, but the division had an airfield, and they were on the south side of it, and I just landed and parked up on the north side of it, and we stayed in that area, shelling the Hürtgen Forest and the Schmidt town of Schmidt, which had bunkers made out of cement and whatever. We shelled them. Now, when I take off, being a Corps artillery, you had all the Corps artillery, and plus you had Army artillery, which are 240s. So I registered somebody on, I don't remember, I think it was an 8-inch on Schmidt, and then all the rest of them come in. I had a 240, a 155 Long Tom, a 155 howitzer, an 8-inch, my battalion, 4.5s, which next to nothing. But I think there was about 8 battalions that landed on this looked like a cement bunker. And a lot of those shells just hit that thing and just bounced off. But those 240s, when they hit, they did a little damage on it. And we finally knocked that thing out, and that's when the infantry finally took off and took the town of Schmidt. But that was, from there we pulled down. I don't know why we went down, but we went down just east of Eupen. Now I spent Christmas in the Hürtgen Forest. We went down to Eupen the day after Christmas, 2 days after or whatever. That's where I saw my first German jet. We were at the airfield. He didn't bother us, but I looked up, and here goes this thing. It looked like a C-47 to me with no propellers. And it went off to the west someplace, and I guess it come back, but it never bothered us. The next thing I know, we got orders, the bulge happened. So we took off from from Eupen and went down to, all I can tell you is it was the 30th Division's airfield. Jack Blum had the 30th Division airfield then. I landed there. He says, "You can't come in here." I says, "Where else am I going to go?" So we stayed there and fought the Battle of the Bulge. The best target I had in the whole war was during the Bulge. The 99th Division, which was one of the last divisions coming in, was the division that really got snookered by the bulge happening. And they all took off, and the pilots had to take off. They couldn't take off the airplane. They left the planes on the field. That was my target. Now, I don't know how many I knocked out. I know that at least 2 must have been knocked out because I saw them on fire. And the idea of that was we didn't want the Germans to get them, obviously, and fly over us unprotected. So that was the best target I had, and here it was our own. After that, we broke out. Well, we got through with that. Well, I went out. I can't remember where we went, but someplace up short of the Rhine. And I had a mission up. My battalion was too far back. They couldn't shoot and cross the Rhine, so I didn't have to adjust them. But while I was there, I got a call, and it says they're sending a colonel from the G3 or 5th Corps. He wants to go up, he says, because the communications from 5th Corps headquarters to the tanks in that unit that was ahead of us couldn't reach them. So this colonel got in there, and we flew up. I went up to the forward tanks, and they had a road that was paved with no trees. So I landed on that with the tanks in front of me and in back of me. The colonel got out, did his business, whatever it happened to be, which was, where are you and what's going on? I took off from there and went back. About a day later, I guess it was, another colonel came in and says, well, we want to go up and do kind of the same thing. So we took off, and this time we went up a little higher and went over this ridge, and here's a bridge. The Remagen Bridge was there. Nobody knew it. Well, nobody back in Corps knew it. Obviously, somebody knew it. And I understand the story I received was that the lieutenant that was in charge of the tanks that took the bridge got there, and somebody says, well, should we go across? He says, well, nobody said not to go across, so they went across, and we put a division across that bridge before it. The Germans tried to knock that out with jets. The jets would come over and come down and try to knock it out. They hit it a couple of times, but it didn't knock it completely out. It really just fell in. By that time, we already had a bridge in by, what do we want? What do they call them? Bailey, yeah. And we got that division across the Rhine. And, but that colonel, when I flew over that, I says, look at that bridge. He says, that bridge isn't supposed to be there. So he was happy. I flew him back. He went back there. So then when that got over and we took the bridge, I left that airfield, or all it was just a field, and went to a German airfield, no cement, just grass, on the west bank of the Rhine River. And I don't remember the division. I remember who had the division, Aviation. It was, he was a major then. It's hell to get old, huh? Anyway, we landed there, flew a few missions across the river. About this time, somebody came up with the idea that we should, what was I going to say? Anyway,
What about Brother Siley? Let's give Brother Siley a shot here.
okay. Well, anyway, from there we crossed the river, went all the way to Leipzig. The airfield we had was just north and slightly west of Leipzig and south. Well, the Elbe comes down and does this. And we were just south and west of that. And there was a concentration camp there, about 200, 300 yards from our airfield. I don't remember the name of it. And that's where the war ended for me, and that was the end of it.
I would have worn my tin hat if I knew it was going to go through the whole war. You know, you do crazy things, I guess. I had one of the first helicopters in Korea. We only had 2 choppers in a division, so it's a heck of a lot different then than it is now. And it didn't matter where you were assigned. If you were a helicopter pilot, you had to fly choppers in addition to your other duties. I was assigned to a field artillery battalion, 39th Field in the 3rd Division. And I flew combat artillery missions all morning long, typically. And then in the afternoon, I'd have come back in, run out of gas in the morning, you know. And the general wanted to go somewhere, or some patient was dying on the side of a hill, or whatever it was. But we took the Rody Rodewald, who was the other helicopter pilot with us, and he and I used to spell off, and we'd fly all morning in whatever. Rody did the infantry stuff, but all morning we'd fly, and then in the afternoon we'd get in helicopters. It was strange. It was about must have been the spring of 52, I guess. And somebody had decided that what we needed was a different, more powerful fuel. We'd been flying on, 9097, lower octane. And we went to 130. And nobody realized that you had to put an additive in the fuel. I'm going to get real technical on it. Had to put an additive in to make it run operate, and it really did run very, very well. The only trouble was the additive caught all the old crap and scales and stuff on the inside of your cylinders, and we began to foul out. Very shortly, all the helicopter pilots that were flying at that time used to carry about a half a dozen spark plugs and a grease pencil and a spark plug wrench. And the deal was, if you looked at the bank of exhaust stacks and you ran that grease pencil down, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, there'd be one of those stacks. When that just was oil, just the rest of it was all burned off. So you know which one was the cold one, and you took the spark plug out, and everybody hoped that the helicoil didn't come out with it. And one day I was flying Gerald Dasher. It was an afternoon, obviously, and we're going from one spot to the other, and I had 5 forced landings. Oh my gosh! It was pretty typical. Anybody that flew choppers over there got used to going in wherever you needed to go in. But that was five landings, auto rotations, change out for another plug or so, go back up, go on the next one. The 5th one, we landed in a rice paddy somewhere north of Seoul, and Gerald Dasher was a great guy, and he says, "Doug, I'm going to have to leave you here. I'm tired of flying."
Hey, Doug, how did you get into aviation? Did you fly in civilian life, or
I'm sorry?
how did you get into aviation? Did you fly in civilian life, or how'd you get into it?
That's a too long a story. Basically, I was raised in Canada, And I saw the Spitfires and the Hurricanes flying around, and all I ever wanted to be was a pilot. Damn. Unfortunately, they finished that war that he fought before I could get into it. And I had an opportunity late in my first lieutenant career to go to chopper school. Not chopper school, heck no. To go to flight school. And J. Elmore Swenson was the guy that got me going too. I went to school and I went 48, 49. And we flew L-16s in my class, but there were lots of L-4s around. My first assignment was to the 82nd Airborne Division in the flight detachment there. Jerry Shea was the boss man, and I was almost immediately grounded because I went on a competitive tour for regular Army commission, which made it so that I had a life in the Army. And that's about it.
I actually, feel like kind of second generation here. My dad was a bombardier on B-29s, stationed on Tinian Island during the Second World War. He still thinks he was in the Air Force. I remind him all the time he was in the Army Air Corps. In fact, when he passed away a few years ago, he still had his original flight suit, which was about my size, and flight jacket. Sure. Is that better? Okay. So I, too, from the time I could walk, wanted to fly. My father instilled this love of aviation. He used to take me to airfields all the time and show me all his pictures from Tinian. I still have those original pictures from Tinian Island from some of his bombing missions over there. Wow. And this was in the early 60s, 70s, and no one ever told me little girls don't grow up to be military pilots. And I didn't know any better. Nobody told me that. So it just seems like throughout my career I was in the right place at the right time. They allowed women to start coming in and flying in the military in the mid-70s, and I was in high school. By the time I was in college, the first group of shuttle astronauts, including females, had been selected. So, somebody asked me last night, was it difficult? And I really feel like, in retrospect, it was a few number of years between the first female aviator going through flight school and when I went through in 81, 82. But I just felt at that point the doors were wide open. I know I have people to thank like General McNair here. He was my first commander at Fort Rucker. And he enabled women to have the opportunities they never had prior to that. So I just feel very fortunate, very blessed that all those opportunities were open by the time I came along.
The 70 years, and we've heard from the greatest generation the first 10 years, and we've heard from the youngest generation, of course, the last 20 years almost, I would say. But no, I'm just so proud and stand in awe of these wonderful folks who paved the way for us and are leading the way for those who follow. But my story is much probably less exciting, but during the Korean War, I was admitted to West Point, 17 years old. And of course, in those days, there was no Air Force Academy. And of course, the services and the branches courted the cadets, and we went out and visited their centers, Benning, Knox, Sill, etc., and also visited all the Air Force bases. And I had the privilege in the summer of '53 as a junior to go to Fort Sill, and they show these dynamic aircraft, L-19s as they called them, because the flight school was at Sill in those days. But we had great exposure, so the Army provided us a tremendous opportunity to see firsthand what we wanted to do with the rest of our life. And of course, the next summer we went on an Air Force trip to Eglin Air Force Base, and they let us fly in a T-28, they let us fly in a T-33, they let us fly in a B-50 bomber, and I want to tell you, there's just no comparison. So I said, well, my tactical officer was a lieutenant colonel, and I needed all the help I could get, so I was beginning to bone the Air Force. And I would have, because 1/3 of each class had to go into the Air Force, and 1/3 of the Naval Academy had to go in the Air Force as well, since they had no academy of their own in those days. Bottom line, I then went to the 82nd Airborne, and they took us up, and they had paratroopers jumping out on one side, and of course we cadets were able to see them on the other side. I said, wait a minute, this is too good. I mean, now some way I could hook up the flying with the jumping. And then, of course, I saw Rangers. I said, oh man, that's the only way to go. So I was torn between infantry, airborne ranger, and aviation. But you can't do all that until the night before we chose our branch at the academy. You choose by your class standing. The Chief of Staff of the Army, General Matthew Ridgway, had directed General Gavin, who was the G3 of the Army, to have Major General Ham Howes, who had just been appointed the Director of Army Aviation, to grow Army Aviation, and they would now take regulars into the Army Aviation program right from West Point. It was an experiment. They didn't do that again until 1983, when, of course, we stood up the branch, and, of course, now it's a very much in demand branch. But I had a problem because a cadet is required to save $400 in 4 years. So you can imagine how much you're paid when you get $5 a month you can spend, so it takes a long time. But you have to pay cash for your uniforms when you graduate, and you have to leave in a uniform. So I had saved my $400. I bought my Air Force uniforms. Again, I had a Colonel Tack from the Air Force. And of course, he really liked to see his cadets go in the Air Force. However, with this opportunity that General Howes presented, he said, we will allow you to choose any branch you desire in the Army that you are high enough to have. And of course, I love the infantry, having seen them operate at Benning. And of course, I really wanted to be a paratrooper and a ranger, but the flying had prevailed. So I had $400 worth of uniforms ordered. So after General Howes spoke to my class that night, I rushed over to the tailor the next day and asked, I've got this $400 worth of blue suits, can I get some green suits, or pinks and greens, they called them. And he said, Cadet, if you buy your Army uniforms, he said, we got a deal. So my whole career turned on $400. Seriously, I really picked up where these gentlemen left off, because we went to flight training in the L-21 Super Cub, and I know about those cables, no radios, hand prop in the morning in the cold Texas air, but went on to, of course, Fort Rucker. Camp Rucker became Fort Rucker, and of course, Army Aviation in its modern era of truly moving towards the branch began in 1955, and that was the year I finished the academy. And believe me, it was a great ride, and I had the privilege and the pleasure of being the first second lieutenant, of course, wearing aviator wings, to go all the way through his career and then be selected for general officer. So it was providential that I would go back, perhaps, as the commander, and just fate, but be there at the time we had the opportunity to study the challenge, and of course became the first chief of the aviation branch. But the great beauty and reward was graduating wonderful students like this, Nancy Curry, who went on to do great things, and of course many, many other of our young graduates. Also, as a brigade commander, I had the privilege of graduating the first woman aviator in 1974, and a lot of firsts in Army aviation that I've seen, but I've never seen it as strong as it is today. God bless.
Their view of Army aviation from its inception till now, the evolution of it. I'd like you to take just a couple of moments and talk about that yourself, and Colonel Curry, you as well.
The opportunities were virtually unlimited. I mean, I've served all over the world, many continents, had the privilege as an aviator from lieutenant on, for doing just amazing things that you would have never had the opportunity to do. My first assignment overseas was in Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits Crisis of '58, where I was an advisor of the Chinese aviation program. Had the opportunity to be there in a very critical period when the 7th Fleet kept the Red Chinese from coming across the strait. On into the Pentagon, when I participated in every major decision that had been made in the implementation of the Air Mobile Division after the air assault tests. I staffed the papers of the air assault test through the research and development community as a captain. I was blessed to have a lieutenant colonel's position. In the Pentagon, it's not your rank that counts. It's who you work for and who has confidence in you. I think I was on every major source selection. Les Gilbert right down there was with me. Les was a major at the time. I was a captain in his office down in his branch. But truly the opportunities we had to grow once the first cab went into Vietnam. And of course, I served as a company commander in an assault company in Vietnam, a battalion commander. But everything we did, of course, was for the soldier, literally. I flew close to 2,000 hours of combat. In my whole career, I flew, I guess, more than 5,000 hours. But each mission you flew, you were always supporting the soldier, just as you were flying General Dash in Korea, I guess, and doing those spark plugs. But the opportunities were unlimited, but I guess the real, I guess, you hear a lot of things. There are no new problems under the sun, just new people facing old problems. And we faced some challenges, but we overcame all of those. And I guess the most inspirational motto I've heard, of course, above the best is our foundation. However, I guess I was talking to the 101st Commander when they came back from Afghanistan, a very simple statement: if we don't fly, soldiers die.
I've only been retired for 6 years now. And, you know, as I walk around the convention hall and I see some of the new technology that's been fielded, both in aircraft and UAVs, you know, the technological change and the rapid nature of the change is just remarkable, you know, starting with those who flew the Cubs all the way through. And when you look at just over this relatively short course of Army aviation, the high-tech nature of Army aviation today is pretty outstanding, and I think we have the greatest trained aviators, the most motivated. You know, I have the utmost of respect for those who have served multiple deployments and tours, and a tremendous number of combat missions that they're flying today. So I guess the most striking thing to me is that I think as an Army we've become very good at fielding new technology and getting it into the hands of the warfighters in a timely manner. And that's always been a challenge, and I think more than ever today we're seeing that, and the aviators not only see that but respect that. My last flying assignment as an astronaut, we were flying with the National Guard unit out of Texas, and we were an augmentation to a unit out of Fort Hood. And the other thing is that the integration of the reserves and National Guards into the total fighting force is something that I think has been a remarkable change over the years, and has been a real plus for Army aviation as well.
Colonel Curry said out there, the technology, and I think back at, we were keeping Piper and Cessna and Beechcraft in business, and now look at the number of industry personnel that are involved with Army aviation alone. You talk about a stimulus package, there's one big one. And you look at the budget that the Army has for the aviation, what it used to be compared to what it is today is mind-boggling.
Colonel Lachey, what was your most memorable experience?
It was my solo flight. But I was fortunate, and God has blessed me that with combat in Korea and on the ground in World War II and in Vietnam, got shot at a lot, but got missed a lot. So that was my best experience on it. I do have one little short story out there, flying an H-13 on an evacuation mission in a guerrilla operation in Korea, and it took a doctor to check on a patient, and on the way back we got disoriented, didn't have too many instruments in the 13, and then it started to get dark, and we were in guerrilla territory, so we said, oh boy, we're in deep trouble. But I always carried gas cans on the litters, and we were just gotten dark, and I saw these lights, and I knew the guerrillas didn't have any trucks. So we said, well, I'm going to land down there and see where they're going. I set it down and sent the doc to talk to the people in case they were enemies, and decided to better put some fuel in this thing because we may be taking a while. So I got the old 5-gallon can and started to fill it up with fuel, and I was between looking at the doc over there, what was happening to him, and all of a sudden, the 5-gallon can hit the stabilizer bar on the H-13 and knocked it out of my hand. I thought I was shot. But I let that go, and the doc came back. He said, they're going to Namwan. I said, great, that's where we going. So I picked it up and put the landing light on, but didn't have any instrument lights. And so he took his ear thing out and held it onto the instrument panel, and I put the landing light, found the road, and we followed that into Namwan and landed. Everybody thought we had stayed overnight, so they weren't worried about us. But that was, I guess, as far as a non-combat experience, that was one of my most interesting ones.
You and 19 other black airmen bought your own plane.
Yes, back in 1948, as I said, we didn't have the opportunity to fly. So there was a millionaire that bought a new Aranca Champion, and he and his friends were flying over a golf course, waving to their friends, and his friend in another airplane crashed into a tree. So he wanted to sell his airplane. I had about 3 hours of flying time, and so he wanted to sell his airplane for $400. So I got 20 other men. I was in the Triple Nickel, the first black parachute outfit at that time, and with 19 other men, we paid $20 each and bought the airplane for $400. He soloed me at 4 hours, and then I trained the rest of the people. But in the interest of time, you asked about the 3 most memorable events. The first most memorable event in Army aviation to me was the opportunity to serve as a commander in combat. One of the things that we were taught when I grew up in the Army as a second lieutenant was that combat was the ultimate, and not for your glorification, but to take care of your men. The second most memorial event that I had was the opportunity to join this organization and to be accepted into it. You may or may not understand what it means to be segregated and not have the opportunity to do things. And the third thing was the opportunity to have a friendship with my friend Captain Sid O'Shea here, who went through flight school with me, and each time we went into combat, he was there, and we've been friends for 62 years now, and that was my third memorial event.
I tell you what, all of you know that just being an aviator and all the things we do is memorable, and you scare yourself 1,000 times, and the joy of it, just tooling around on a great day is a memorable time. It's a time I miss very, very badly. I was just thinking about the technology, Carl. I was wandering around down here today, and I was talking to somebody who were producing maps and pictures of where people are going, and we got talking about navigation. Just about the close of my career, and you were coming in. You were at Bragg at Rucker that time, I think. The thing that was closest to my heart, I was the director of training and development at that time. And we were coming up on the night vision goggles, an awful lot of resistance to it, because the first one we tried were made for Jeep drivers. And we were trying to see a little bit better. Wanted to see a wire. That would have been a great thing. And the other thing, the thing that was just perplexing, and I carried it over into civilian life, is how can we navigate in the treetops at night, where survival was the objective, really. And we did all kinds of things. I think the last thing I did was to work a set of goggles that were very precisely rigged for what I won't use technical terms, but what they had done to light to make it into simulate moonlight. And we put these goggles on a guy and train him to gradually begin to feel very comfortable hovering around the tops of trees. In the daytime, the beauty of it was the instructor pilot could see all that was going on and could take over if things got hairy. But this guy was challenged, and the idea worked. The only trouble was somebody brought GPSs and all kinds of other. The point was that the requirement was there, and technology solved it before we had a chance to do any more Rube Goldberging in it.
Well, I guess the helicopter end of it. When I got back from Europe, I was down at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and somebody up at Fort Bragg had nosed up an L5 and broke the prop, and they didn't have any. I got a phone call and says, "Do you have any props down there for an L5?" I said, "Yeah, I got one." He says, "Would you bring it up to us, and when we get our replacement, we'll send it down here." I said, "Okay." So I flew it up there. Got up there at the field, and the guy says, "Okay, you leave the prop here. You'll have to take the paperwork into headquarters." So I went into headquarters, and I opened the door, and the Army Air officer was there, and he looked up and says, "Goody, how would you like to go to helicopter school?" I says, "What in the hell is a helicopter?" This was January 1946. And I went off to helicopter school. And that's the most memorable thing, really.
Colonel Curry, your most memorable experience?
My first space flight was in 1993, and at the time, General Gordon Sullivan was the Army Chief of Staff. And this preceded email, and so I was in our crew quarters. You're in quarantine for about a week before you fly into space. And I was in the quarantine facility down at the Kennedy Space Center the night of my launch, and they knocked on my door and they said, "You have a fax here from General Sullivan." And I was a captain, a fairly junior captain, and I wasn't used to getting a fax from the Chief of Staff of the Army. But it was something that I folded in my pocket, and don't tell NASA, but I took it along in my launch and entry suit, and I still have that framed. I have very few things on my wall. I tend not to fill up my walls, but this is one that is framed and has always been by my desk no matter what job I had. And in part, what General Sullivan said is, remember, no matter where you, your craft, and your crewmates are, you will always be in sight of an American soldier serving somewhere in the world. And every time I looked out the window of the space shuttle on all 4 of those missions, that's immediately the thought that I had, is that we were circling the globe, and no matter where I looked, there was an American soldier serving somewhere in the world, doing a job for the Army and in service to his nation, just like we were. We have a high visibility job, but it's an Army job, and it's a service to our country, just like every soldier serving somewhere in the world. That's probably the most memorable.
General McNair.
Nancy, that was an out-of-this-world response. I think I'm tearing up. Well, in brief, and not to copy Sid and all the others that have gone on before, but if you would go look at my laptop in my room, you'd see my computer password in 2 words is solo flight. But when I went to Gary Air Force Base, since we didn't have a primary school, we went to the Air Force, and we had Air Force IPs for primary. Then we went to Camp Fort Rucker for the tactics. But I'll tell you, when that first lieutenant of the gave me my dollar ride. As you know, you go out and do a couple of chandelles. When he put it in a spin, and I'm looking right down there over the nose of this L-21 Piper Cub, I said, this is not for me. But I said, I'll sure give it a try. But that was truly a physically, emotionally, and spiritually moving experience. But within the Army, as time passed, I had the privilege of commanding a company in Soc Trang, Vietnam, the Soc Trang Tigers. 27 helicopters and 300 and something men, and I think we still hold the record for flying the greatest number of hours of an assault company with only 27 of the 31 aircraft authorized, 3,850 hours in 1 month. It was the most intense month of combat that I saw in my 2 tours as a company and battalion commander. Tet of 1968, the Viet Cong and the NVA were determined to, of course, make their last-ditch attacks upon our installations. And so during Tet, which was, of course, a truce period, at 0300 in the morning, they hit us on, actually it was the morning of January 31st. And they didn't let up for 17 days anywhere in the country. Literally, of course, the Marines were under siege at Khe Sanh. We didn't have any resupply to speak of for those days. And of course, we didn't even make coffee for the company, so I went to the Navy and they gave me a can of coffee. Luckily, it was a 25-pound can from my company. But I'll tell you, 17 nights we defended the perimeter of Soc Trang, and all day, every day, we were out trying to defend the cities of the Mekong Delta. But to lead those young 19 and 20-year-old warrant officers, I think the average age in my company, at that time, I think that, as I recall, I was 33 years old, and I was the old man. But the average age of my pilots was like 23 years old. And the crew chiefs, they worked all night to keep the aircraft up. And of course, we were off again the next day, landing. We didn't have any infantry on our base. We defended our own facility. But I'll tell you, the American fighting man and woman, there is no measure. That's mine.
Thank all the members of Quad A. It has meant a lot to me as a soldier from the old Army to be accepted into an elite unit. And it's not about me, it's about the organization. And this organization has presented me the opportunity to do the things that I believe all soldiers and even civilians should be able to do. And I thank Quad A for it. It means a lot. I know you may not understand what it means to come from a segregated army and to be accepted like this. And my friends, I mentioned Sid, but there's also all of the people that are sitting at these tables, and I made the one mistake of naming a person and forgetting that there's others, and I apologize for that. But thank you very much, Quad A. Quad A, thank you for the opportunity to serve, and I really do appreciate it.